Part 1 of this two-part presentation contained BGA advice on how to fly a winch launch safely and the actions to take if the launch fails. In this second part, we go into a bit more background detail and provide some of the reasoning behind the advice given in Part 1. As before, a short presentation cannot cover everything. Please ask an instructor if you need further information or explanation. Some, but not all of the charts contain a voiceover introduction like this. You will remember that one of the key recommendations for safe winching was to maintain a shallow climb until a speed of 1.5 times the stall speed was achieved, with continued acceleration, and to rotate into the main climb at a controlled pace. How was this advice formulated? Before the BGA started the Safe Winch Launching Initiative, some of the hazards associated with winch launching were not well understood. It was well known that you should release before a wing drop in order to avoid a cartwheel. Also, it was well known and widely taught that you should lower the nose to the recovery attitude after a launch failure in mid-launch and restore the approach speed before doing anything else. But the conditions that could result in an accelerated stall and flick roll during rotation were not known, and the combinations of airspeed, climb angle, reaction time, pushover G and other variables that could lead to an unrecoverable situation after a launch failure near the ground had never been quantified. Mathematical modelling of the mechanics of winch launching was undertaken to identify the conditions that could give rise to a stall during rotation and the circumstances in which power loss below 100 feet would be unrecoverable. By understanding the conditions for a stall during rotation and unrecoverable circumstances below 100 feet, it would be possible to provide theoretically backed advice to avoid these dangers. Let's investigate the conditions for a stall during rotation. This chart shows how the stall speed during rotation increases as the rotation rate increases. The example used is a glider with a 1G stall speed of 34 knots. At a modest rotation rate of 6.3 degrees per second, taking the glider 5.5 seconds to reach a climb angle of 35 degrees, the glider's stall speed has increased from 34 knots to about 42 knots. Rotating at 20 degrees per second pushes the stall speed up to around 50 knots. The resulting stall is an accelerated stall. This can lead to auto-rotation, which may turn the glider upside down so it hits the ground with the cable still attached. As we can see, the accelerated stall speed during rotation is dominated by the rotation rate. Cable tension and climb angle only slightly affect the stall speed during rotation. Why does the stall speed increase during rotation? The stall speed increases because the wing is required to make extra lift. When the lift is not vertical, increased lift is needed to provide enough lift in the vertical direction to support the glider. More lift is also needed because some of the lift is neutralized by opposing the pull in the launch cable. But the biggest contribution to increased lift during rotation is to generate the force necessary to accelerate the glider in the vertical direction from 0 knots at takeoff to about 35 knots at the end of the rotation. If too much lift is demanded from the wing as a result of a high rate of rotation and the wing stalls, the glider may roll inverted with fatal consequences. The increase in stall speed during rotation can be minimized by rotating at a moderate pace. We can prevent a stall during rotation by ensuring we combine a moderate pace of rotation with an adequate airspeed. This leads to the advice to maintain a shallow climb until reaching an airspeed of at least 1.5 times the stalling speed, with continued acceleration, followed by a transition to the full climb at a moderate pace. The other area of the launch where the causes of accidents were not properly understood was after a launch failure in the early stages of the climb. Until 2005, accidents of this type were the most common winch accident, typically resulting in one serious injury each year. 80% of these accidents occurred at less than 50 feet, and usually were characterized by a stalled or heavy landing. In 20% of these accidents, the glider hit the ground nose first, unstalled. The model for this segment of the winch launch is in 4 parts. Firstly, after the launch failure, there will be a reaction time before the pilot begins the recovery process. During this period, the glider will continue to climb and the airspeed will be decreasing. The second stage begins when the pilot pushes over into a recovery dive at a constant reduced G. The third stage is the acceleration of the glider during the recovery dive. Finally, the pilot pulls out of the dive to level flight for a landing. The glider is unlikely to stall during the pushover because the stall speed is lower than the 1G value. The critical stage for a stall is at the beginning of the recovery dive. This is because the airspeed may be low and the stall speed reverts to the 1G value as soon as the nose stops pitching down. The 4 parts are shown on the following diagram. The diagram shows these 4 stages schematically. The model predicts the airspeed at the beginning of the recovery dive and the overall height lost for any combination of initial airspeed, reaction time, pushover G, recovery dive angle, and other parameters. These 2 indicators determine whether a safe landing is possible. It seemed from the accident record that in many cases the pilots who had an accident after power loss below 100 feet had allowed the glider to adopt a combination of airspeed, climb angle, and height from which it was not possible to recover. The model allowed an investigation of safe and unsafe combinations of airspeed, climb angle, and height, with a view to making recommendations for keeping safe. There are 2 main hazards from a launch failure near the ground: a stall and hitting the ground nose first, unstalled. Let's examine how a stall can arise. After power loss, the glider goes uphill until the pilot pushes over, and it continues to lose airspeed in the pushover until the nose is actually lowered. This chart shows that a glider suffering power failure in a 25-degree climb at 55 knots typically has an airspeed of only about 32 knots at the beginning of the recovery dive. This is why, following power failure in mid-launch, it is essential to give the glider time to accelerate to the approach speed before manoeuvring. An airspeed of 32 knots at 50 feet probably means a stall and a crash. Hence the advice to maintain a shallow climb until reaching 1.5 times the stalling speed with continued acceleration. There is no prospect of recovery if the glider stalls at a height of 1 wingspan or less, which is the height at which most of these accidents occur. So an apparently safe launch airspeed might prove to be unsafe if the climb is too steep near the ground. These results assumed a pilot reaction time of 1.5 seconds and a pushover at 0.5 G. We then modelled the effect of a different reaction time and different pushover G. In this example of a launch failure in a 25-degree climb with an airspeed of 55 knots, if the pilot were to lower the nose the instant that the launch failure occurred, the airspeed at the start of the resulting dive would be a safe 49 knots. A 2-second delay reduces the airspeed at the start of the recovery dive to just 33 knots. The next chart shows how the recovery dive initial airspeed depends on the pushover G. Following a launch failure in a shallow 15-degree climb, a moderate pushover of about half a G is adequate. A more vigorous pushover might be disorientating and only very slightly increases the airspeed at the beginning of the recovery dive. However, as the climb steepens, for example to 25 degrees, it becomes more important to push over at up to 0 G to avoid a low airspeed at the beginning of the recovery dive. The analysis presented in the last few slides highlights the importance of not climbing too steeply in the early phases of the launch, and also the dramatic impact that pilot reaction time will have in avoiding a stall. After power loss low down, we also have to avoid diving into the ground. After power failure near the ground, if the nose is lowered too much, the glider may hit the ground nose first, unstalled. On the other hand, pulling G will be ineffective if the glider suffers a high-speed stall. So what is a safe dive angle? This chart shows the height lost after achieving 55 knots in a recovery dive. The height consumption increases gradually up to a dive angle of about 25 degrees. As the dive steepens beyond that, the height lost increases dramatically. In mid-launch, you can zoom up in a pull-out from a steep dive to convert airspeed into height. But at 50 feet, the ground gets in the way. An appropriate recovery dive angle in mid-launch is around 20 degrees. Be careful about lowering the nose too much near the ground. This modelling supports the advice on how to recover from a low-level launch failure. Immediately lower the nose to the appropriate recovery attitude. Aim to do this as quickly as possible, ideally aiming for a reaction time of less than 1.5 seconds. Push over at 0.5 G from a shallow climb, more vigorously from a steeper climb. Do not dive more steeply than 20 degrees. The appropriate angle very near the ground will be much shallower than this. The modelling shows that to avoid a stall during rotation and to avoid a hazardous configuration after a low launch failure, you should follow the advice in the BGA Safe Winch Launching leaflets. Maintain a shallow climb until adequate speed, 1.5 times the stalling speed, is seen with continuing acceleration. Ensure the transition from level flight at takeoff to the main climb is controlled, progressive, and lasts at least 5 seconds. If the launch fails, immediately lower the nose to the appropriate recovery attitude. The BGA has published a Safe Winch Launch leaflet, which expands the advice in this presentation. The same advice with additional background is in a booklet published in February 2010. Both, together with simulations and a quiz to test your knowledge of the subject, are available on the BGA website at www.gliding.co.uk/safe winch launching. As well as being available as downloads, clubs should also have stocks of the booklet and leaflet. Please secure your own personal copy of both publications. Thank you for viewing this presentation. If you have any questions about any of the advice given, please don't hesitate to discuss this with an instructor. Instructors may request additional information from safetycom@gliding.co.uk.